As we get started this morning, I'd like you to think back to when you were a kid. And if you were like me, no matter how hard you tried to be good, every now and then, you did something that, shouldn't have done. Maybe on purpose, maybe not. But also, if you were like me, your parents tried to discipline you enough to know right from wrong. And my parents always taught me that if you do something wrong, it's best to admit it. And if you lie about what you did, that just compounds the problem. So it's interesting to me as you see children grow, it doesn't take them all that long to learn that sometimes they can try to dance around the truth and not lie, but also not admit to what they did either. And I was no different as a kid. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're in the living room and your mother comes running into the room and says, "What was that crash? Did you break my lamp because you were throwing a ball in the house that I told you not to throw?" And so you don't want to say, "Yep, I did it. I'm sorry." You're not going to admit it. So you might say something like, the ball just flew out of my hand, and once it hit the wall, and it bounced off the wall, I can't help where it goes from there. So not my fault. We don't want to admit what we've done. Or one of my favorites is, let's say your mother hears crying in the room that you're at, and let's say it's your brother, and he's got a bloody nose now. And your mom's like, "Are you two fighting? You bloodied his nose?" "I don't know what happened. I was just swinging my arm, and it's not my fault if he got too close to me and, got hit." And, you don't want to admit that you hauled off and, popped him a good one. So you don't admit it. You try to play these games and dance around it, that kind of thing. And when it's a kid, it's a little, comical looking back. But sometimes in life, and in the Bible, we're going to look at this morning a situation where there were two women. Their names are Shiphrah and Puah. I put them in the title of the message. They came right out and told a deliberate lie that they knew was a lie. And we read in the Bible, God was okay with that. God blessed them because of a lie that they told. What are we supposed to make of something like this? Because we're not supposed to lie. We tell that to our kids from the time, they can start talking. You don't lie. We know God doesn't like lying, yet what in the world's going on here? Well, we're going to get at it here this morning, and we're going to read some verses from Exodus chapter 1. I'm going to start in verse 6 and go to the end of the chapter. It's going to start by talking about Joseph. This is the Joseph with the coat of many colors, the one who his brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt and had issues with Potiphar's wife and all that. That's the Joseph we're talking about, not Jesus' father, just to clarify different Joseph. So beginning in Exodus chapter 1, verse 6, the word of the Lord says, "Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, who did not know about Joseph, came to power in Egypt. 'Look,' he said to his people, 'the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country.' So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with hard labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, 'When you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, If it is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of God's holy and perfect word. So this morning, I'm going to start a series of a few messages, maybe, go a month or maybe a little more. We'll see how we like this, of confusing and challenging Bible passages. This here being the first one. And I already outlined a bit of what the problem is. You have individuals who, in order to serve God, told a lie, and God blessed them for it. What are we supposed to make of this? Well, we'll unpack that with the time we have together. First of all, let's start with Pharaoh. Pharaoh is, of course, he's the head honcho in Egypt. In ancient Egypt, they actually worshipped Pharaoh as a living god. That doesn't make any sense to me and probably to you, because the God I serve is not human. The God I serve can never die. Yet Pharaohs died because they're just men, and then the next one would take over and they'd worship him like God too. And what is ironic is that their God on earth was scared. Scared that the enemies might be too numerous. If they want to attack us, these Hebrews, which scholars tell us could have been as many as 2 million in the country by that time, rough estimate, they might join with the enemy, fight against us, and then defeat us and then leave. So Pharaoh's scared. This starts with his fearfulness, was what started this whole thing. And Exodus chapter 1 is such an important chapter in the entirety of God's plan. In the whole Bible, Exodus 1 is big here. This sets the stage. It sort of puts a close to what happened and ushers in what would follow. So what they did first, Pharaoh said, well, we got to do some population control here. First of all, we're making all these Hebrews slaves all of a sudden. Now, in our day and age, there's a lot said about immigration. And these Hebrews, they were immigrants into Egypt. Could you imagine, in our day and age, if you turned on the news tonight and you heard that the president said anyone who is an illegal immigrant is automatically a slave? Wouldn't fly, okay? Couldn't happen, and nor would we want that to happen. That's what Pharaoh did. That if you're not Egyptian, you're not, you're a slave. You have no rights, no property, all this kind of stuff. So that's the first thing, and he's acting out of fear. Why did he do this, first of all? Well, of course, he apparently didn't like the Hebrews, but also the men typically were the workers in the field. They worked hard, backbreaking labor. It says that they built storehouses, they built cities. That's hard work. So probably in Pharaoh's mind, he's thinking, if these men, if we work them really hard and ruthlessly, as it says more than one time there, maybe some of the guys will just die. And then that'll sort of help us control the population. Pharaoh wouldn't be upset if that would happen. Also, if you work them real hard, when a guy's working for 12 hours, 14 hours a day, backbreaking physical labor, when at the end of the day, he goes home to his wife, he wants dinner and he wants to go to sleep. So Pharaoh's probably thinking he's not going to be in the mood to be making babies, making more little Hebrew kids. So let's work them really hard. Didn't happen the way the Pharaoh anticipated. Pharaoh underestimated the Hebrews' desire to be fruitful and multiply. They just went home after a long day and they started making babies like nobody's business. So it didn't work out the way that he anticipated. We don't know how long it took for this first phase of Pharaoh's plan for him to find out this isn't working. So he's starting to get really scared now, and he says, all right, this isn't working. Plan B. Plan B is a lot more sinister than Plan A. So he calls Shiphrah and Puah, these two Hebrew midwives, to him. And just a note on them, most likely they were probably the lead or head midwives, because if there were even 1 million Hebrews, which could have been twice as many of that, just on basic averages, there would be several Hebrew babies born every day. 2 women aren't going to handle all that work. And, women can be in labor at the same time and all that. So there were probably a lot more midwives, but these were the 2 that were in charge. So Pharaoh calls them. He says, you know what? This is what we're doing. And since I'm in charge, you go and you deliver these babies. You check it out. And if it's a boy, kill it. It's easy as that. That puts Shiphrah and Puah in a very difficult situation. It's what we would call an ethical dilemma. Are you complicit with murder? We call it today infanticide, killing infants. Or, do you do the right thing? How do you do the right thing? How do you honor God and also save lives at the same time? Well, this really isn't all that different than our world today. There are places like China. They still have a one-girl policy in a family. And it is so heartbreaking when you read the stories of what goes on over there. And it's not reported in the news. A lot of us probably don't even know it still happens. But a one-girl policy is just that. If a family gives birth to a second daughter, they get discarded in the dump pile in trash. And like I said, there's no words for it, but it goes on today. Now, when I think of what goes on in China with the one-girl policy, that makes me think, why didn't Pharaoh want to kill the girls? Why was he after the boys instead? And I think there's a reason for that. What's interesting is this was probably 1500 BC, so we're talking 3,500 years ago. They knew then that genetics and so forth works in a way where the male typically perpetuates the race. What I mean is if a Hebrew man gets a non-Hebrew woman pregnant, they'll still be mostly Hebrew. It doesn't work the way if it's a Hebrew woman and a non-Hebrew man. Let's say he's Egyptian. The Hebrew race will get diluted more quicker if the woman has the baby. So Pharaoh's okay. It's really not about population control. It looks like it, but it's not. It's about getting rid of all these Hebrews. That's what he's concerned about. That's why he says, let's get rid of the boys. In China, they want to get rid of the girls because they have the babies. So, it could be more so like population control. And they want Chinese people. So we'll keep the boys alive. You see how it all works? They knew this 3,500 years ago. And so this very sinister plan he brings in front of Shiphrah and Puah. And he says, I want you to kill the boys. That easy. Nobody's going to know. There's probably 2 midwives at a birth anyway. The one's going to attend to the mother immediately after. The other's going to take the baby. All you got to do, just slit its throat. Just do something like that. And just say, oh, I'm sorry, it didn't make it. That's all you got to do. Well, obviously they couldn't do that because that's murder. That's wrong. So they come up with this story that they say, the women, they're very energetic, they're very vigorous. They're not like these Egyptian women that just take their time in labor or in labor for 48 hours. By the time we get there, they've already had them. And, nothing we can do. That's what we call a lie. Be completely honest. They intentionally said something that wasn't true. That's called a lie. That's one of the commandments, by the way. Don't bear false witness. Now, I believe it was a lie, and I believe it was the right thing to do. How do we make sense of this? This is why I brought this up as a confusing passage of the Bible. There are some scholars who try to jump through all sorts of hoops and say maybe they actually sort of were telling the truth. Maybe there were some that did have babies before they got there. They're saying this is what always happens. That's a lie. It is. Now, keep in mind, this is such a unique and specialized situation. This is what do you do ethically whenever to obey one of God's laws, you must disobey or break another of his law? That may possibly happen in a fallen world such as ours. Sometimes it's not as perfect as we'd like. Hey, I can just, be truthful with Pharaoh and also keep the babies alive. It's not going to happen. Think of it this way, too, that Shiphrah and Puah, they themselves had to stay alive. This isn't like what goes on with Christian persecution in the world. People will hold a gun to somebody's head and say, are you a Christian? You can't say, no, I'm not. That way, I'm still going to live and I can share the gospel with more people. It doesn't work that way. However, just to save your own skin, Shiphrah and Puah knew, they had to have known, that if Pharaoh kills them, he's going to appoint more midwives to be in charge, and they're going to see what happened to the prior ones, and eventually he's going to find midwives who are going to comply. Somebody somewhere is going to do it. So in order to save all of these lives, they themselves have to stay alive. That's what justifies them trying to save their own skin. I know there's a lot packed in here. It's a lot to wrap your mind around, especially if you haven't read that passage in a while or read the book of Exodus. So I did say that there are some some scholars are divided, trying to think, was it truly a lie? I think it was. And I'd like to quote from you a theologian. I'd never heard of the man before, but he wrote on this, and I read it and thought this guy's spot on. His name's Dr. Ligon Duncan III. I think he's a British theologian. This is what he said. He said, now, of course, during their interview with Pharaoh, they attempt to hide the truth from him. Yes, they lie. Many commentators very kindly try to get them off the hook for this. They say things like, well, maybe it was true what they said. It doesn't matter whether it was true what we said. We were told specifically in the passage in Exodus 1 that they determined not to do what Pharaoh asked them to do. And then when he asked them why it was that this was not coming about, they didn't say, well, we decided to not do what you told us to do. They say, well, there's this other explanation. So they are deliberately attempting to hide the truth from him. I agree with Dr. Duncan. I think they were. I think that's what we're supposed to come away from the text thinking. We're supposed to understand this was a very unique, tough situation. They were between a rock and a hard place. They couldn't, it wasn't easy. So they had to decide, what's the better good? Do we honor the truth or do we honor life? They chose life. We honor life first. Now, I don't want anyone at all to come away from this saying, Pastor condones lying. I don't. Lying is bad. Lying is one of the 10 things God said don't do. Written in stone, don't bear false witness. It's such a unique situation that they couldn't have it both ways, okay? Hopefully we never find ourselves in a situation like this. I can't think of a time I've ever been, and I certainly hope I don't anticipate ever being in that situation. I don't want anyone rationalizing, thinking they're going to lie about something this week. This is why we don't teach Exodus 1 to children in Sunday school. We don't want, and they're kids. They're not developed. They're not mature. They're not thinking about all the nuances. You might teach them and say everything the right way. They might come away from it thinking, these women didn't want something bad to happen, so they told a lie, and so God blessed them. So that was good. So when I get home, if I break a lamp, I don't want something bad to happen, so I can tell a lie. And Mom says, why'd you do this? Sunday school, they said, hey, I can tell a lie. And then they're mad at the Sunday school teacher, they're mad at the pastor. So we don't teach Exodus 1 to children for that reason. Also for adults, sometimes we might have, the desire to sort of rationalize taking some shortcuts. Let's say you own a business. You can be honest in your business dealings. You might be a little dishonest and, make an extra sale. Somebody didn't know that, I don't know, they decided to buy from you when they otherwise wouldn't because they didn't know. So you can't say, well, I got more money, which means my tithe to church is going to be higher, 10% of that, so God wins because of my lie. That's not what we're talking about. That is not two commandments button heads. It's not the same thing. So just want to clarify that. It's about the ethics of truth. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dr. R.C. Sproul, the late Dr. R.C. Sproul. 10 years or so ago, he passed away. This is what he said about this. He said, and he clarified, we are always and everywhere obligated to tell the truth to whom the truth is due. We are to speak the truth where justice and righteousness requires the truth. End quote. He then says about how sometimes righteousness would require that a murderer be deceived. That makes sense? If you know somebody's going to use the truth for a satanic, evil purpose, they don't deserve the truth. And that's okay. He goes on to say, you are not required to tell everything you know, or even tell the truth if it is necessary to stop a murder. There are occasions where it would be a sin to tell the truth. But, end quote, he said there are occasions, not often at all. He goes on to talk about Nazi Germany. If you were a good German family, you knew it was bad to kill Jews. So if Jews wanted to be hidden in your house, you keep them up in the attic, and the Gestapo knocks at the door. Hey, your neighbor said that some Jewish family came in the other day. Where are they? Do you say, well, I have an obligation to the truth. Oh, yeah, kept them up in the attic. You can go get them. What's going to happen? You know what's going to happen. They're going to be murdered. They're going to be killed. So that's where, is it better, do you honor the truth or do you honor life? They honored life. Nope, I haven't seen any Jews around here. Maybe they mistook me with the family down the road. That's a lie. But you're doing it to preserve life. And these are such, unique situations that, again, I can't repeat enough. Most likely, we're never going to come across this at all. So then, why are we talking about it? Because it's not really about the lie, though. It's not about lying. It's not about rationalizing lying. This is about Shiphrah and Puah being obedient to God no matter what it took. And they had such a relationship with God, they knew the right thing. They knew that you honor life first, then you honor the truth. Hopefully those two can coexist, but in that situation they couldn't. Such an extreme situation, such an extreme example here. I don't want, and I'll pick on the guys here, I don't want guys to go home and say, well, truth versus living. So if my wife asked me, does this dress make me look fat? If I'm honest, that might make her a murderer. because she's going to kill me. Not what we're talking about here, okay? And try to, liven it up a little bit, lighthearted example, but it's not about the lie. It's about obedience to God. And if you notice here, in our fallen world, life isn't always black and white. We wish it were. We wish it were so easy that I always am truthful. I always, preserve life. I always do this. I always do that. It's just not the way that it always is. And I have been very, conscientious this morning, paying attention to use the names Shiphrah and Puah. I could have taken every opportunity to say the midwives. That'd be a lot easier to say, be shorter, but I didn't, and I did that for a reason, because first of all, the Bible records the names. So of all the midwives, it was in God's providence that Shiphrah and Puah's name be recorded for us. And since the Bible records it, I want to use their names because they deserve to be remembered for their faithfulness and obedience to God. And that's another thing. God honors faithfulness. God remembers the names of the faithful. Contrast that to Pharaoh. When we read in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, all these different pharaohs are in power. They're not all the same one because, it covers way too much time. You can't live that long. Never once in the Bible do we read of the actual name of a pharaoh. They're always Pharaoh, Pharaoh, Pharaoh. You can read a history book and find out which one it was, but God did not record and remember those names because he set himself up as a God on earth. He is a false God. He's not faithful. Yet, the Bible doesn't remember the name of Pharaoh, but he remembers Shiphrah and Puah. Honestly, a week ago, if you would have asked me what are the names of Hebrew midwives, I'd say, they're not in the Bible. I realize they are. So I started using their names, and I'm glad that I am doing it that way. Also, just a little perspective on this. Moses wrote the book of Exodus. Moses lived to 120 years old, and most likely he wrote Exodus not too long before he died. We don't know exactly when. Let's say he was 100 years old. He could have been 110, I don't know. Shiphrah and Puah had this incident before Moses was born. That means that the Hebrew people remembered the names of Shiphrah and Puah, and they passed them down to the subsequent generations, the whole way down to Moses, that he recorded it. The Hebrew people recognized the faithfulness of these two women, Shiphrah and Puah. And therefore, it was in God's providence through the Holy Spirit that Moses included them in his writing of Exodus. Again, no names of Pharaoh, but we have Shiphrah and Puah because they are faithful and obedient to God. I would actually call it extreme obedience to God. Because again, it's easy to rationalize things. If you think, I think God might be, wanting me to do this, but maybe not, and I can come up with a lot of reasons not. Shiphrah and Puah said, can't do it. It is wrong what he's asking us to do, so we have to preserve life any way that we can. So the message this morning is not to look for loopholes to lie. Absolutely not that reason. It is look for opportunities in life to be faithful to God. Look for opportunities to be obedient to him. Shiphrah and Puah could not have known the ramifications of what they did when they said those words to Pharaoh that day, saying that the Hebrew women, they're more vigorous and they give birth. Because they said that, that put into place Pharaoh telling his people, just throw all the baby boys into the Nile. We can't rely on the Hebrews, so do that. Because that happened, this baby was put in a basket. He was drawn out. He was given the name Moses, which means drawn out. He rose to power in Egypt. God ended up giving him the 10 Commandments. Shiphrah and Puah had no idea that any of that would have happened because of their faithfulness, all according to God's plan. We don't know what might have happened if they had been disobedient, I do know that God would have found a way through somebody else who was obedient, but the fact is they were obedient, and that's what we remember today and what we remember when we say their names, Shiphrah and Puah. They knew God, they knew right from wrong, and when they were called to exercise this extreme obedience by misleading Pharaoh, someone that was evil and would use the truth in an unrighteous way. And so my closing prayer for everyone here is that you would all have the courage when called upon to obey God, even when it doesn't seem like it makes any sense, when it looks like I'm doing something I shouldn't be doing, but there's a reason, there's a righteous reason for it. Again, hopefully we're never in that situation. It's so extreme, but it happened for Shiphrah and Puah. It is theoretically possible for us. Bottom line is, obey God when he commands you to do something. So let's bow our heads now and close our time with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for these confusing and challenging passages of the Bible. This is just the first one. And we read this, and maybe we read it before and really weren't sure what to make of it, because on one hand, we see a lie being told, but then we see you, God, blessing them with families and all after that. Maybe we just went on to the next chapter. Maybe that'll make more sense. But there's a reason for it, and this is such a unique situation. It's not rationalizing lying. It is obeying you. That's what we want to focus on. And God, we are so thankful that it was in your providence to preserve your people, that we had Moses, that we had the law, and that set the stage a long, long time later for Jesus to come in and to usher grace. That's the other side of the law and grace. We really can go back and point to Shiphrah and Puah as critical characters in that whole story of redemption. We are so thankful for their obedience, and God, we pray that if we ever had the opportunity, that we would be just as obedient as they were. We thank you and praise you in Jesus' holy name. Amen.